Hello, I'm Barbara Peters from the Poison Pen, and I'm really pleased to be talking a new conversation for me with Kirt Shineman, a playwright who has a production in progress that runs till November 21st. And as I understand it, this is an original play that you wrote, but based upon incidents in the life of Agatha Christie. So what inspired you to write this play, Kirt?
Well, I've always been an Agatha Christie fan, and as a young teenager, read lots of her murder mysteries because they were accessible. And for this particular play, I was interested in the end of her life, and as a mystery writer, what happened to her at the end. A lot of studies were done with her manuscripts to find out how she lost language and how she lost memories. And her last few books that she wrote as an older writer did not fare as well, and because she had declined with dementia. And part of the play is about what is it like when an artist, a great artist like Agatha Christie, loses their words, loses their past. And in real life, that's what happened to Agatha. She was being raised or taken care of at her manor. Taxes were extreme. Her daughter and her son-in-law and her second husband were taking care of her, and she died of dementia. Didn't, eventually stopped her organs because of the dementia. And what a great woman to have written for so many years and to lose that one thing she survived on, which were her words. So this is a bit of a murder mystery too, because her brain is taking her on a murder mystery to find out who's been killing some people. And she forgets a lot of her past, and she's trying to recreate some stuff to keep her memory intact. So really it's a ghost story of the last few days of Agatha Christie.
Well, let's remember she died at 85, which actually for somebody born when she was born at the turn of the 20th century was actually before then, because she died in 1976. So she was actually born in the late Victorian reign. And you're right, it must have been really hard for her not to talk to you. I did two things. I have to write a chapter about Agatha Christie for a forthcoming academic publication. One of my very favorite books, I went to my own bookshelves, obviously, is her autobiography. And I think it's a marvelous book. She, it was published by Dodd Mead and copyrighted in 1977, but I think she wrote it sooner. She was born in 1891, as I said, lived in 1976. I have a feeling that this might have been, says she started to write it in 1950 and finished it in 65 when she was 75. And I think that her mental decline probably was just beginning to creep up, and she put on an awful lot of weight, and over the years, the same thing that bothered her, she wrote about. So it's not surprising that she'd have been vulnerable to dementia. If any of us are paying attention to health warnings now for the aged. I mean, I'm 80, I'm going to be 81, and I'm still kicking around as though I were in my 60s, but we've come a long way with diet and exercise and so forth. That was not going to be a regime that she was likely to have followed. But to make it even more interesting, my very favorite Agatha Christie is a memoir she wrote really about her meeting and marriage to her second husband, Sir Max Malibun. It's called Come Tell Me How You Live. But what fascinates me, and I was just leafing through it, is that Max wrote an autobiography called Malibun's Memoirs, and his view of his wife and her life is clearly different in a lot of respects than hers. For one thing, he was 10 years younger, so he did take care of her, and he did describe at the very end how she died. So have you looked through Max's memoir?
Yes, and I find Max's memoir, there's fun to read those, her autobiography and his version, to see where there's a bit of a contrast.
Right.
And it's fun to see, how she was viewing things and how he viewed things. And she really was in love with Max. She writes very, very positively, romantically about him. She loved him as a second husband. She always said he was a good second husband. They had lots of the same interests too.
Well, it's my view that she was extremely lucky that Archie Christie left her. And Max was a much better husband for her once she began her writing career. And she'd always wanted to travel to a lot of exotic places. And he gave her that opportunity. In fact, they met when he was on an excavation and Sir Leonard Woolley introduced them. And she never would have written They Came to Baghdad or Murder on the Orient Express. She probably wouldn't have written her only historical novel, Death Comes at the End, if she hadn't been to Egypt. It turned out well, but the awful part for her, and it's hard for us today with divorce laws so different and attitudes so different, to realize that, I mean, she was brought up in a very conventional middle-class household. She had a very conventional, strict governess whose view of the world was purely mid-Victorian. And regardless of how she felt about Archie after 11 years of marriage, it would have been devastating for her to be left for another woman and to be divorced, however much she didn't really care about him anymore. It's hard to say whether she really did or whether she just couldn't overcome the bounds of convention. What do you think?
Well, and as the play kind of explores that she was madly in love with him, but maybe in a way that she couldn't help him notice that their relationship was declining. But it was also the time period was, the 20s was a bit different towards women and men having affairs. And could he go on having this affair with Nancy is an interesting question. And if he'd stayed married, him going off to the war, that also impacted their marriage and their relationship. So, and he didn't live much longer after they divorced, but she kept the Christie name, so she really did cherish a lot of what he had helped her with and helped her grow in her writing. I think Max was far better for her. It gave her ability to travel the world and also dig into things like Murder on the Orient Express would never have happened if it wasn't really for Max. She got to experience those. She'd written a lot of short stories, and then he really helped elaborate more novels with her. And then, of course, her daughter helped her with those autobiographies you pointed out, too. Rosalind was a major supporter and kept her writing. As an editor, she would check all of her writing and make sure. She was a silent partner. We often don't hear about the daughter's impact. Rosalind was very strong in their relationship. But I think it was very helpful that she kept the last name Christie. It shows how much she respected him even after she became Max's wife, and even Dame Christie she thought sounded better than Dame Malibun.
Well, you may be giving it a slightly, see, I think that once she had started publishing as Agatha Christie, it would have been extremely difficult to change her name. She'd already branded herself as Agatha Christie. So I'm not entirely sure that her decision to stay Christie wasn't really more about that than it was about how she felt about Archie. And she may also have felt that Rosalind would have preferred, that she kept Archie's name. It would have been hard for her. It's still a problem today, when people divorce and so forth. It's hard for children of one spouse to deal with a name change. I've been divorced and I've kept my not this husband, but earlier husband's name, because by then it was what I was known as professionally.
Right.
And, I think that might have had a lot to do with it. What I really liked reading Max's memoir, and he has chapters about Agatha. One of the things he points out was that she was homeschooled, that she wasn't sent off to a typical English boarding school or school for girls like Rodin or something. And so a lot of her imagination and so forth wasn't beaten or educated out of her. She was able to be a flyer. The other thing he pointed out, which I didn't really think about, was that she had a natural mathematical ability. And that being true, it really helped her, in her plots, a lot of which are kind of like clockwork. They take an enormous amount of skill to make all the pieces work. I mean, she's often criticized for being less good about character and more about plot. And those of us who loved Murder at the Vicarage, her first Miss Marple Village Mystery, recognize that that's the one where she's funny. You know, it's her most humorous book, and sympathetic to the characters. Poirot was always a bit like, you know, like winding up a clock, right?
Right.
Yep. So I did think, but the other thing that Max said, which I had never thought about, but looking back on my own life, I can see that it mattered. The almost fatal thing that happened in her first marriage was that Archie took up golf. And Archie, you know, he was a risk guy. I mean, you know, he was a pilot, he was a decorated war guy and the whole bit. But golf can become an obsession. And it's one that's hard to live in that world if you don't share it with somebody. I myself went through an obsession with tournament bridge. I'm a life master in tournament bridge and the whole bit. And my current husband and I decided we'd both give it up when we got married because of its, it can take you over and it can be very divisive. And I realized that Nancy was a golfer, wasn't she?
Yes. And Nancy took up golfing prior to meeting Archie. She had been golfing a lot, and that was something that they had in common. And it was something that Agatha didn't want to do. She didn't appreciate golf. She did appreciate the outdoors, but she was at a time trying to keep her writing going, and she could write almost anywhere. She liked writing in cafes. She had lots of different notebooks, and what we've learned going through her notebooks is that she didn't complete a story within the same notebook. Whatever was handy, she'd grab a notebook and write into it. And so you can find bits and pieces in all of the notebooks at around her estate, or notes, sometimes just written on the back of a email or a back of an envelope kind of thing, or notes on napkins that she could have, something she could grab quickly. And back to your puzzles, she loved puzzles, and she loved doing grids. In her notes, there's lots of grids where she'll have the names of the characters and then different clues that she's lined up, almost like a diagram, to point out where she's trying to lay them in. And then, like Murder on the Orient Express, she tried to find what the rules were at the time, what was acceptable for murder mysteries, and then change it. So she would say, this has been done, what hasn't been done? There's a great diagram in some of her notes that shows what she wants to do next and how to upend the genre of that she'd already has helped establish and how to then alter it. So she was pretty amazing that way.
She was. I mean, she was a risk taker in a different way than Archie. She really loved breaking convention. I mean, you know, if you know her work, you realize that The Murder of Roger Ackroyd pioneered the unreliable narrator, which has taken over much of crime fiction today. She loved sort of locked room mysteries. I mean, really, Murder on the Orient Express or Death on the Nile are variations on an English country house murder, in the sense that where the murder takes place, the scene is contained. It's on a train or it's on a tour boat of the Nile. And so only the people on the train or on the boat, or if you go to Hercule Poirot's Christmas, which had a different name, which I cannot remember, which is her country house Christmas murder, only the people there, one of them has to be the murderer. And, you know, that's a classic form that has been extended to, can be a murder at a theater. Rex Stout wrote a Nero Wolfe, in which it's a banquet, and only the guests and the waiters in the banquet room, you know, could have done it. But she really loved pioneering. The only, you know, among the Golden Age writers, Dorothy Sayers only really wrote one book that was kind of Christie's, called Five Red Herrings. And that one depends upon railway timetables. If you read it, it's not as well done as a Christie. I think in many ways it's her weakest book. She was much more interested in character and less interested in puzzles. I mean, Gaudy Night, her third of her Harriet Vane trilogy, is really one of these dark academia books like Donna Tartt wrote, you know.
Right.
but they were very different. And that's one reason people tend to line up with Sayers, or they tend to line up with Christie. And then there were other wonderful people like Josephine Tay, who was all about reputation, Marjorie Allingham and Mr. Campion, who was eccentric, and she liked the unusual, sometimes with an almost paranormal feel to it, whatever. And Christie was also incredibly reserved and private and shy. I've talked to Peter Lovesey, and I did an event recently. We were together. I met him and H.R.F. Keating and some other prestigious members of the Detection Club at Agatha's centenary in Torquay in 1990. It was my first appearance at one of those events after opening the Poison Pen in 1989. And, they all had stories to tell about how shy she was. She agreed to be president of the Detection Club and lend her name to it. But the part of the deal was that she never had to stand up and actually preside or talk. There was a, like a stand-in for it. She was really uncomfortable with that. And, the truth is, Kirt, I didn't think that her marriage with Archie would have held up, Nancy Neely or not. I don't see Archie ever putting up with a wife who became famous, and she was always going to outgrow him. Don't you think?
Oh, totally. And she was outgrowing at a time that, he was very patriarchal. He wanted to keep it the old way, and she was already moving very forward. Although she wasn't a feminist, she did assert women's rights. She didn't like the public eye. She didn't like to do lectures, or she would do book signings only for a cause, and then she didn't really talk to the people in the line, but she would do very short and very quick. And Rosalind was usually involved in helping her do that, or her editors. What I also find fascinating too is we haven't really addressed it, is her theater experience. She loved writing murder mysteries for the stage because it's already so contained. And, in Mousetrap, one of the longest running plays on the West End, it's all very, very tightly contained, and you only have a little bit of characters, and you have to work all of it on the stage. And she liked going and playing with the actors and walking with the actors and walking the stage. But if there was ever an audience, I think she would deeply shy away. But she, like Witness for the Prosecution, she really loved the detail that could be done in a closed environment. She did it with 10 Little Indians, and then there were none on stage, where she rewrote the ending 3 or 4 different times. So there's a different ending from the movie, from the play, and from the novel. And it's fun to compare those because she was constantly working out a better way. She likes to make the audience happy. She never wanted to go against audience sentiment.
No, it's really true. And I went to the banquet or the Agatha Christie centenary weekend in Turkey. I should have looked up, but they did put on one of her plays, and it was awful, to be honest. I can't remember. It wasn't any of her headline plays. It was pretty creaky. It was a little bit like The Mousetrap, but not as good. I agree with you that Witness for the Prosecution is her best play, I think. And of course, it was an amazing movie with Charles Laughton, and I can't remember who else.
And it's one of her favorites, mostly because of the way the end worked. And Mousetrap wasn't one of her favorites. She couldn't really understand why people liked it so much, but she didn't mind that they did like it, because she says, this is becoming traditional and classic. And maybe the one you saw, which I've also seen, it was not very impressed with it, because now we're just used to the style so much. It was called The Verdict. And that was one of Agatha Christie's less well-known plays.
I should have looked it up. I actually kept the programs in the playbills and so forth from 1990, but I forgot to go. I was so busy digging into my books, I forgot to go get it. It wasn't The Verdict. I can't remember. Of course, it was basically almost an amateur theater production too, which didn't really, do it any good. So what's the title of your play?
So the title is The Mysterious Disappearance, since she disappeared when she was when she found out about Nancy and Archie, she ran away for a few days and then reappeared. But it's also more about her current disappearance with dementia and how words are disappearing, how her relationships are disappearing, and disappearance of her memories. So she's trying to get that autobiography that you showed. She's trying to get the revisions to it done so that they can get it mailed out. She had a high productivity she tried to keep to book a year, print another book every year. That was a lot. I mean, if you think about it, she did 80 publications. And that's hard, especially when they had a series of books that would always come out at Christmas. And it was through the book club. And we'd get these beautifully bound books from Harper Collins, and they're beautiful. And she wanted to just get them out. And so she was always working on a new one. So you didn't get a lot of time. And she didn't have help like some of the writers today who have lots of people writing sections of the story. She was the only one who'd write it. So,
well, that's true. In fact, in his memoir, Max points out that, you know, they put aside a room for her on one of the archaeological digs, and she would just pound away on the typewriter. I mean, she would write it straight off. And she wrote, "Come Tell Me How You Live." I looked up the copyrights, 1946. That was renewed in 1974. So this book she wrote when she was really at her prime. And, you know, memories would have been intact. The autobiography, as we've already said, she worked on for a lot of years and finished it when towards the end of her life. I mean, I always think of her, you know, her childhood, a lot of it was on a very private property. And, you know, I always think of her as kind of at the bottom of the garden, you know, playing makeup games and all. I mean, it really fostered her imagination, and not having to go to a formal school, but being educated with her mother allowed her mind really to, you know, run free and develop. So it looked to me as though this play has been produced before, maybe at the Phoenix Theater, and this is a new production.
This is actually the first full production at Phoenix Theater. We had a workshop, so we didn't have a set, we didn't have costumes. It was a reading. They had the scripts in their hands, and this is a full production, totally, you know, fully memorized, fully mounted, with lights, all that kind of jazz, all the theatrical components. And we do touch on a lot of those Christie elements we've kind of spoken about. You know, but if it hadn't been for the location, for her lack of television, lack of screens, we don't know. We might have had a completely different writer, but she really stayed away from television. She stayed away from movies. She wrote. She didn't like going to movies. She'd rather go to the theater because it required you to work harder and to think more. There was a movie that came out of about her, just called Agatha, with Redgrave and the guy from The Graduate, what's his name? Dustin Hoffman. And she hated it. She hated the script when it was coming out. The estate didn't like it. Rosalind didn't like it. So they even tried to stop that production because they just didn't want a movie made of her life and her disappearance. She was slightly embarrassed about the time with Archie and how he was having an affair against her, and that bothered her. So she didn't really like talking about it. And that question always came up. She tried to avoid it in any interview.
Right. Well, one reason she was media shy was the media would never drop the question. You know, they always wanted to insert it into any media that she agreed to. And she hated that. So I can certainly understand why she would feel that way. I mean, I've never thought that she set out deliberately to punish Archie. I don't think she was that kind of person. I think she probably genuinely was so distressed it was a fugue that, you know, that she fell into. And I really resent, there are a number of books that have come out. Marie Benedict wrote one called The Mysterious Mrs. Christie or something. And I think people are, you know, everything Christie continues to be an economic engine. And I think that people are trying to mine what happened to her and make it sensationalist. There's something there is a TV movie about her. And just in the last month, there are two novels that came out. One's called Murder at Malibun Hall, which is clearly the author and I did an event for it. And you know, she acknowledges that Malibun Hall, she made it up because it had to be a big country estate in order to have the cast of servants for the sort of upstairs, downstairs kind of a plot that she wanted to write. And Agatha is really hardly ever there. So, you know, it's not that much drawing. It's just cashing in on the Christie name, so to speak. The other one is called Murder at Greenway, which is the name of Agatha and Max's country estate in Devon on the Dart River, which I got to visit when Rosalind and her husband were still living there. So that was really interesting. Matthew Pritchard was our guide, he and his wife. And it now belongs to the National Trust, but it was still a family home when I visited it. And it was, in fact, taken over during the war twice, once by children, evacuees, and then again by American servicemen who left behind a mural. I thought it was in the dining room, but I think I'm wrong. I think it was in the library. Anyway.
And it's a gorgeous house. It's beautiful.
Yeah, it is. There's a wonderful photo of it here in Max's book. And I have a picture I took then of Catherine Aird, who was chairman of the Crime Writers Association in 1990, welcoming us all into Greenway with Rosalind standing over here. And her husband was out in the garden because that was his thing, right? Is the real gardener. And, you know, I remember it very clearly. I'm trying to remember if Greenway, if Agatha had said something once about, you know, how she, in part, she wrote just to be able to afford the house.
Yeah, the taxes on that house were enormous and they almost lost it twice.
Yeah.
And what I also love about Rosalind, and since you've actually met the real Rosalind, we had to, we couldn't do some of the things that Rosalind is really known for, but that was the 70s. She was a big smoker. She liked to smoke a lot.
Yeah.
And of course, her husband, Tony or Anthony Hicks, was also a barrister, and he was married to a barrister, but they both had to give it up to help the Christie Foundation. And Anthony was a drinker. He loved his scotch. And he would go out and hide it in the rose bushes and have another shot of scotch. But,
well, it wasn't a healthy lifestyle. I think some of the British survived their unhealthy lifestyles because they lived in the country and their exercise was prodigious. You know, I've often wondered how any of the Victorians lived to be over 60 the way they ate. And, you know, and let's face it, infectious disease there was nothing to help you combat it. People died constantly of stuff that today antibiotics cure. It's the fact that Agatha Christie went to truly unhealthy places with Max, you know, where, I mean, anything could get you, and traveled in those kinds of circumstances. She survived 2 world wars. She survived the influenza epidemic that killed more people than COVID after the First World War, and she made it to 85, which I think is remarkable. But, you know, Max does touch in his memoir about her decline, and he writes very touchingly that as he finished his memoir, he was wheeling her away from lunch or something when she just died. And, you know, you're right that it was a care situation, and being a caregiver, we now know, for people, adults who are disabled, whether physically or mentally, is an incredibly taxing job. And, you know, there's been some, again, sensationalist speculation that, you know, he took up with Agatha's secretary or something. People want to create, you know, come on.
I don't know.
You know, I mean, for one thing, he probably just, you know, if she declined to the point where she wasn't a great conversationalist, you know, I think that people bonded together, caregiving, become very close, and you don't have to read anything more into it. I've always felt that he really loved Agatha and admired her. Certainly is the case reading his memoir, which is a terrific book. And I realized that I may need to reread it, Malibun's memoirs, and read Come Tell Me How You Live. Really, a lot of writers don't have that they're not that self-revelatory, you know, it comes
Right.
across in their books, but they don't necessarily want to plumb. I'll tell you who really has impressed me, no end. We've been friends forever, but Lee Child, AKA James Grant, allowed a woman named Heather Martin to write a biography of him, which is really a tell-all. I mean, it's a warts and all book, and he's incredibly candid in it. And I admired that so much because he's still alive, you know, and I feel like those kinds of things are more often dealt with in the absence of the subject, but no, not him. You know, I don't watch The Crown, for example, or Diane. I'm not willing to watch these kind of sensationalist, you know, productions that where the real people are still alive. I find that incredibly hurtful, and I don't care for it a bit. I don't know how you feel about that, but
Well, one part of the story that I love that's in Max's book is how he would sometimes go to bed, but she would not recognize him and not know who he was, and she'd lock him out of the bedroom. And so then he'd have to make accommodations and find somewhere else to sleep in the house, you know, downstairs on the
right.
couch or something. And he said, you know, you just learned to deal with those things. As she was declining, the hardest thing he said was watching her get smaller because of her aging. She was heavy, but then she started getting very, very small because she wasn't eating well, and it was just hard to get her to eat. And I think Max truly loved her very, very much and did a lot for her. Because they were kind of out there in the boonies, really, if you look at the maps and look where their house was. So they were pretty well secluded. So to go and get pharmaceuticals or to go into town for groceries, it was a big effort.
Right. Well, I mean, you know, he stuck with her till the end. And so you have to admire that. I don't think Archie would have been a great caregiver. So, you know, Archie was about Archie as far as I could work out. So anyway, as I said, it seems like, you know, in some respects, people think of it as a tragedy, and it was emotionally horrific for her given the way she was brought up. But I think it was the lucky break of her life myself. So
And I think it was good for Rosalind too, because she got a better stepdad.
she did. And in fact, Max dedicates this book to Rosalind and writes very lovingly of her. Well, I have tickets to come and see your play, which is on, tell us where it is and what the dates are.
So it's at the Theater Artist Studio near Paradise, the old mall that's been torn down, but it's at 4848 East Cactus. So it's right by Tatum and Cactus.
Right.
So very easy to get to. Nice theater, great space. We have a beautiful set. It's been designed by Douglas Clark, so it looks like some of what we'd expect an Agatha Christie library to look like. And so you'll feel comfortable. You'll recognize a lot of the Agatha Christie touches around the room. And it's a fun show. There's lots of light comedy and without making fun of any character. So people have enjoyed it greatly.
Well, I'm really looking forward to it. It runs through November 21st.
Yes.
And there are two performances. I think it's the 7th and the 14th, where there is a conversation opportunity after the performance is over. So I signed up for the one on the 14th, so we could do that.
Awesome.
Yeah.
One of the things we'll discuss is Mary and how Mary Westmacott and some of Mary Westmacott novels and how that plays into Agatha Christie's life. And the success of Mary Westmacott wasn't as strong as Agatha Christie's mysteries. Her romances were a little less powerful, but they're still interesting to read because they give us a lot of her understanding of romance and how she fell in love, and lots of personal hints towards her feelings with Max.
Well, they are more autobiographical. Nobody could say that Poirot is autobiographical, even Miss Marple. I'm not a fan of the Tommy and Tuppence work particularly either. It's very light. It's what we call cozy today, you know. But you know, she had many facets, and I think she explored her life in the world through her books in a way. And, and let's face it, she was really brave, I think, to write an autobiography.
Yeah.
And, and very loving. And if you read Come Tell Me How You Live, it's a wonderful memoir to a marriage and reveals more of her sense of humor than you might otherwise come across. Anyway, Kirt, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you. I'll look forward to seeing you on November 14th.
Thank you, and great interview. Good luck with Poison Pen.
Thank you so much. We're in our 32nd year, so yep, we're going well. I'm giving it to the staff. That's my exit strategy. So it'll be around for a long time. They're a great bunch. So anyway, looking forward to meeting you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.